Hello, and welcome to the How I Tested That podcast. I'm your host, David J. Bland. I'm an author and advisor, and I'm fascinated with testing early-stage ideas. I've helped companies all around the world, and in this podcast, I connect with entrepreneurs and innovators who had the courage to test their ideas with real people in the market, with sometimes surprising results. Please join us as we explore the ups and downs of experimentation together. In this episode, I'm joined by Mark Graban. He's an expert in lean leadership, psychological safety, and continuous improvement. Mark and I discuss the idea of the smallest test of change, a principle rooted in lean thinking that can be applied far beyond manufacturing. Speaking of manufacturing, we sort of geek out on what we've learned from being around Toyota and seeing how they work in practice, not just in theory. We also dive into why organizations reward people for sounding certain, how leaders unintentionally punish experimentation, and why psychological safety is essential if you expect people to admit what they don't know. Mark shares how he's applying these ideas to his own work by testing a new book through iterative publishing. If you want to learn more about creating a culture where people feel safe to speak up and use smaller tests to drive meaningful change, this episode is for you. Enjoy my conversation with Mark Graban. Welcome to the podcast, Mark.
Hey, David. It's great to be here.
I'm so excited to have you. I think we first met, oh my gosh, it was probably like 2010 or 11 in San Francisco at one of those really, really early lean startup events.
Yeah.
And I was like, this guy knows what he's talking about. I should pay attention to him. And fast forward many, many years later, I'm sure our thinking has evolved, and I'd love to cover that today. But I was just thrilled that you would make time to hang out with us and our listeners.
Yeah, it's great to be here. Well, thinking should evolve, and hopefully I still sound like I make sense.
Yeah, I think I was thinking way back to the early lean startup movement and just the people that were drawn to that. And before I knew it, I was like up at one of the conferences giving one of those really stressful auto forward slide talks. I think you did maybe one of those as well.
The Ignite format where, every 15 seconds the slide. So you better not cough or clear your throat because there's no catching up, right?
Yeah. And I think that was still relatively early on in my speaking career. I had given talks other places, but I had never done that format. And I have to say that format in front of 1,000 or so people is not my favorite.
I've managed to avoid doing that format again.
Yeah, but I remember, I think I still have pictures of all us in the front row from, it must have been 2011 or 2012. And I just remember hearing you talk about, at the time you were testing healthcare and such, and maybe you can just give us a little bit about where your focus is before we jump into all of your philosophies on testing. Yeah,
I've done a lot of work as a consultant in healthcare for 20 years now, but that's been based upon, the roots, my origin story with any of this goes back to lean manufacturing, or, I think I made a meme once of the old gray, black and white image of some fighter, and it's like, cranky of like, I was involved with lean before there was any startup in it, or, so lean manufacturing is my roots. I started in the auto industry as an industrial engineer. So to me, lean meant TPS, or the Toyota production system. And some of the lessons that I was able to bring into healthcare, Toyota mentors of mine, I've never worked directly, I've never been a Toyota employee, but in my consulting world, I've gotten to work with a lot of former Toyota people who are so generous in sharing what they've learned. And one of the most useful phrases right up the alley for you in this podcast, the phrase, the small test of change. So like when somebody's got, like we tend to value and love big, grand ideas. And the Toyota people have a way of not trying to knock you down, but it's a helpful discipline to say, what's the smallest test of change that we could do? Small, cheap, quick, because it's focused on learning. So that's one of the reasons I gravitated to the lean startup movement and what Eric Ries and when I got exposed to the work of Steve Blank. And I'm like, yeah, this is lean. It's lean in that thought process of scientific problem solving, experimental problem solving. And then, I think the philosophical layer is kind of getting over ourselves and getting past the idea of saying, I know the answer, as opposed to let's learn what the answer really is by testing a change, testing a hypothesis, and, figuring it out instead of knowing and having the quote unquote solution up front. Like the other word that the Toyota people use, and they're hesitant to say solution. They'll use the word countermeasure, which sounds as highfalutin as a hypothesis in some circles. But, the idea of a solution sounds so definite, right? As opposed to a countermeasure is something we go and test and we learn and we continue those cycles. So the build, measure, learn cycle, I learned it as the PDCA cycle or the PDSA cycle, plan, do, study, adjust. Like that's such a helpful discipline, I think, regardless of where we're working, what industry, big companies, small companies, what have you.
I love that. Let's chat Toyota maybe for a little bit, because we've both had the pleasure of, I think, being around them and being influenced by them. And I remember it was early on, I think, in the lean startup movement when we were at some kind of happy hour south of Market in San Francisco, and someone younger, it was a younger crowd coming to the event, and they said, they were like, "When did you get into lean?" Like it was like just the way they said it. I felt like, what? Like, wait, what kind of lean are you talking about?
Yeah.
But it was such a bizarre moment for me, because I was like, wait, are you talking lean manufacturing? You're talking lean startup, like lean Six Sigma, which is a whole other thing, which I personally don't even subscribe to. No. And so when I was working with Toyota, and we met some of my teams, they spoke up on the stage at early conference, and I've worked with them since then. It was so interesting, because you think about how great they are at lean manufacturing, although they don't call it lean, of course, but applying that to business, it is a different context. I mean, have you seen that at companies where it's like, oh, we get this, but now we're trying to apply it to maybe a new business idea or product idea or service idea, and that's context switch. Have you seen folks grapple with that?
I think one of the biggest challenges is people's preconceptions about manufacturing. So it's easier for me to connect the dots between the environment of manufacturing and the environment of a hospital, because if I'm working with a hospital, odds are I'm the only one in the room who's spent significant time in both settings. So people's preconceptions of manufacturing, people think of it as, if we were to play word association, old, dirty, dangerous, outdated. It's what my grandpa did. Mental models of, think of like Fred Flintstone, Homer Simpson, and Peter Griffin, like basically all worked in like some form of manufacturing adjacent world. Like this is not a world that people generally admire. Like it's just looked down upon a little bit. And people think, well, what could we learn from manufacturing? Well, we can learn a lot. And I think when you view things in terms of processes and systems and mindsets and behaviors and cultures, and these things are incredibly transferable. But I think people in healthcare, look, I love people in healthcare, but they say, well, healthcare is different. I'm like, well, sure, yeah. Hospital, people will say this to me with all seriousness. They'll look at me and say, the two things that I hear are, well, Mark, patients are not cars. And part of my reaction, I usually don't say this, is like, I'd like to think I look a little smarter than that. I know patients aren't cars. And the corollary is, the hospital is not a factory. And I'm like, well, we could play this game all day long. iPhone is not a coffee cup. Are you tired of it yet? But part of that's maybe a defense mechanism, and part of it is maybe, a sense of professional superiority, for lack of a nicer way of saying it. So, I'm empathetic to that, but it's not about copying tools. Some tools translate really well from one setting to another, but a lean application in the operating room is not going to put the operating room table on a very slowly moving conveyor belt, which is not going to copy that tool. And if somebody did propose that, they'd get thrown out of the hospital real quickly, because they're copying the tool instead of helping people adapt the thinking and the mindsets. And I think that's what the lean startup movement has generally done, really well, is taking the thought processes and the mindsets and some of these cultural factors that are really transferable. And I usually get to work with people in healthcare who are at least open to testing the idea if they don't fully believe yet that these ideas are transferable.
Yeah, I want to dig into that a little bit. If you look at hospitals, and you have much more experience I don't necessarily often work with hospitals and healthcare, but I dabble in it. And things like checklists, like checklists from even the military or aviation, applying that same rigor to, preparing for a surgery or something. There are things you can learn from other industries for sure. But I think you're touching on something here with the principles, maybe not so much the tools, but maybe like the principles of having a hypothesis, being willing to test it, gather evidence, get insights from that. Coming back to scientific method even. Mm-hmm. I do think what I see people struggle with sometimes is they might be very, very comfortable doing that, let's say in a manufacturing setting, because I do work with some manufacturing companies. But when we say, should we be manufacturing that thing at all? How would we test that? It is a bit of a shock to apply those principles on something that maybe they're not used to questioning.
Yeah. And I'd be curious again, like the knowing trap. Are different business functions or people with different educational backgrounds taught to know the answer? Are we rewarded for knowing the answer? Are we punished for struggling to figure it out? And most problem solving is a struggle, if we're going to be honest about it. But yeah, I think I'm not a psychologist, and I'm not the only one who makes the joke about being a recovering engineer. But I think engineering school was all about calculating the answer. And the real world is way messier than that. So learning to work through the ambiguity, the messiness of iterative problem solving. It's okay to iterate. You don't have to develop the perfect countermeasure or product or solution right away. I think some of that is maybe a little self-imposed. But then there are the organizational dynamics, that I'm a little bit more experienced with, or thinking about, how do leaders react? How does the organization react when somebody says, I don't know, or when someone says, let's go test that, or when someone says, we tested it and it didn't work out the way we predicted? That either gets rewarded or it gets punished. And, it's not hard to figure out that punishing those things really, stifles improvement. It stifles innovation. It stifles the organization. So there's a lot of managerial habits. We crave certainty. We reward, people for sounding really confident. Like, what's the expression of, somebody's sometimes right, sometimes wrong, but never in doubt. Organizations tend to respond as they call that executive presence, I think, in some circles. So a lot of this is imposed on us by organizations where people learn very quickly, well, if I get punished for saying I don't know, I'm going to pretend to know. And if I get punished for trying something that doesn't work, I'm either going to learn to place really safe bets. Somebody I've worked with along the way, it's taught me if you know the outcome of an experiment in advance, it's not an experiment. And, people will either get really cautious or people will start fudging the results. And if you say failure is not an option, well, then hell, I'm going to make everything look like a success, even if it's really a failure. And that's a problem. That's a problem in a lot of organizations. And, I'm even reminded, of a mentor of mine in healthcare. He talked about when he was working in his training, he would carry this guidebook in his pocket, and he got chastised, because the idea was like, oh, well, you're a doctor, you should have everything memorized. I'm like, well, that sounds dumb as an outsider. Like, how could you possibly memorize everything? And I even once had a doctor leave the room in the middle of my patient encounter with them, and they came back in and literally apologized and said, I had to go look something up. And I made a point of saying, well, that's okay, and thank you. And I'd rather you take a minute to look it up than guess and maybe be wrong. But I think we've all had managers or executives that punish the uncertainty or punish the admission of not knowing or having to figure it out.
Yeah, there's so much to unpack there. I think what I'm hearing you say is, I might be able to apply these techniques and tools and this thinking in a very confined, structured situation where I'm not punished for getting it wrong. And then you kind of take me out of that and say, hey, should we be working on this at all? How would we know? And it's like, wait. It comes out in different ways. Even with the lean startup movement, it started to seep in early on of, you have to come up with your assumptions. Okay, well, I don't want to get that wrong, or I have to prioritize them. I want to get it right the first time. I said, you're not going to get it right the first time. There's no way of knowing
Right.
all the assumptions in this work and being able to prioritize it exactly right. It's going to be a little wrong, and that's okay. We're going to go find out and come back. And that's to your statement about iteration.
Yeah.
If you're not rewarded for that, the behaviors become, I have to get that map right. And when I design my experiment, I'm going to set the success criteria so low that I can just hop over that, or I can make it look like a success no matter what. Or maybe I make it a really, really long running experiment so that, maybe it'll never finish and we'll move on and priorities will change before it's done. I watched all these behaviors creep in, and I think it surprised me early on because I thought, oh no, wait, this is a new way of working and we're going to resolve all of this. But it's really not that simple.
No. And again, like going back to roots in the Toyota production system, I hear mentors in my head reminding me the difference between knowledge and an assumption. And we would be better to have knowledge than assumptions. But if you're making an assumption, it's better to state it and then think, well, how would we test that assumption? That's lean startup language. That's your language, and it's rooted in the industrial base. And that's why I think it is very legitimate to call it lean startup, because of those mindsets. It's not lean in terms of not having enough for all the problems with the word lean. That's a conversation for another day. But the point I was going to make is, the Toyota people would ask basically, if you say you know something, how do you know that to be true? Not in a dickish way, but like in a constructive, like, let's explore that. You say green is going to be the hot new color for cars next year. How do you know that to be true? It might be a prediction. It might, who knows? But, it's good to separate. And I agree with you, David. There are times where our assumption is a placeholder, and it's better to acknowledge that than to pretend like it's certainty and knowledge.
Yeah, I agree. And it's that question of how do you know, or what evidence do you have? I think this is why I end up changing a lot of my tools over the years. Was I just want to get to the root of that question of how do you know? It's like, I'm certain. Well, why are you certain? I just know. Well, no, that doesn't work. So what is the evidence behind you being certain? And I've heard everything from, we just did this really deep research last week and we have relevant information, to, my nephew thought it was a good idea. And this was a VP of a very successful Silicon Valley company. And I thought, we're making $100 million bet on what your nephew would like to see. And that sounds absurd when I say it out loud, but a lot of that stuff is happening inside companies until we surface it. And I think when it comes to, when you said, I don't know, that's one of my favorite things to go into a company and ask a leadership team. Like, when's the last time you said, I don't know, in front of your team, in front of your people? And you'll see this really different reaction. Some people will say, I just said that yesterday in a meeting and it was fine. And others will say, I will never say that. And I was like, okay. So this is where I'm just trying to do a temperature, check here on who I'm working with. And there are folks who have been rewarded for being right. They're through school, through early career, through late career. And it's really a shock to their system to say, just say I don't know in front of your peers.
I heard somebody once say, basically, I can't say I don't know because my employees will lose respect for me. And I'm like, that's an assumption we could check too, right? I mean, do you know that? How do you? I mean, people know you're not perfect. You're not exactly bursting the bubble of infallibility. But I mean, I think it's interesting. Sometimes people, maybe it's a founder privilege or C-suite privilege. They'll preach that, we want the organization to be data-driven and lean, and then they don't practice the same things themselves. They get to go run on a hunch. They get to just make decisions because, I know, my experience, my gut. I guess if you're placing a big enough bet and you're wrong, you might get fired. But the higher up you are, it's not going to ruin your career. It might just push you into a nice cushy retirement earlier than you wanted. But, sometimes, executives don't always have to practice what they preach, I guess. But if these are good ideas, they should be good ideas for CEOs, right?
Yeah, something I learned, I think, early on, I've been crazy enough, I guess you could say, to lead transformation work in the past. And, what I noticed was, you brought in the board and C-suite, and they're like, hey, we want to do this thing, and we want to be more lean and all that. Okay, yeah. And what you notice in the org, if you think of your org hierarchy, at the bottom, these behaviors start changing at the team level because we're doing training and coaching and we're working through all this. And then there comes this point in the journey pretty early on where they say, hey, I'm working differently, but why is my boss still treating me the same way?
Mm-hmm.
And then you go up a middle manager. He's like, look, here's how you interact with him differently. Here's how you practice this. And I'm like, hey, I'm working with my teams differently, but the execs are still treating me the same way, So it's really interesting when people approach like transformation work, which I've seen anyway, and they start at sort of this bottom level, like, oh, we just got to get the teams working and fix them and all that, which is a whole other probably podcast as well. It's really interesting to see this kind of light bulb go off and say, but yeah, other people aren't treating me differently. What's in this for me? Or are they along this journey? And so I think you're right in the sense of sometimes we see these transformation efforts happen inside healthcare or inside other, industries, and the behavior is all focused on the teams changing and maybe middle management. But then you see a lot of the same behavior at the exec level. And usually, from my experience, that's going to plateau and start declining because we don't have it like this nice vertical slice through the org that is behaving differently.
Yeah, it's how am I being treated and what am I seeing? What behaviors am I seeing leaders modeling or not modeling? When there's a gap between what leaders say and what leaders do, that certainly causes a lot of consternation and conflict. They say they want us to be innovative, but then they punish the things that we do to try to be innovative. They want us to be innovative at a 100% success rate.
Agreed. And I just think, not to make the whole podcast about Toyota, but there's such an amazing company to work with. And it's just so refreshing to see this idea of, we'll help you figure it out. And I think, I don't know, I had the pleasure of meeting John Shook. It might have been actually one of the, I think you met him, you've known him as well.
I've known John a long time, yeah.
Yeah, and all these stories of people trying to copy what Toyota did, but not understanding the why, and then yelling at their employees or reprimanding them because they stopped the line or didn't have the answers.
Yeah.
None of that is going to stick when they don't understand the why behind why Toyota operates the way it does.
Yeah, and the why, and it's not even so much why do we use the tool, but the behaviors and, I think mostly unspoken recognition within Toyota that psychological safety is the foundation for anything. And psychological safety meaning just quite simply, do I feel safe to speak up without being punished? So pulling an andon cord in a Toyota plant, is a classic example. People feel safe to do that because they know it's safe. They've been taught it's your job to pull the cord, which flags and signals a problem. I'm being a bit pedantic. It doesn't automatically and always stop the line. Like the LinkedIn memes are directionally correct when they say, any worker can stop the entire factory. I'm like, oh, okay, my pedantic instincts kick in.
And it's a button, not a cord now. Apparently.
Well, it could be a button. But anyway, the andon is I can speak up and flag a problem or share a concern or admit a mistake or ask for help. And within seconds, somebody shows up basically asking what's going on, what can I do to help? And most of the time, the problem gets resolved within the job cycle where things don't stop. But part of the mental model would be quality and safety come first. And if the line has to stop because of a quality problem, that's actually the best thing for our long-term productivity and profitability to do that. And so part of the line might stop. And look, Toyota's still got to build cars. So they have some strategic buffers in the line where the other pedantic point is that if the line stops, only a segment of, it's not the entire factory. But the LinkedIn meme should be, at Toyota, people can ask for help without getting punished. They can admit a mistake without getting punished. Like that, to me, is the headline and the transferable idea. So there's a classic story going back almost 20 years. The BBC went and visited factories, a Toyota plant in Kentucky, a new Ford truck in Dearborn, Michigan, like the home and the roots and the origins of Ford. And they said at the Toyota plant, the andon cord was pulled 2,000 times a week. Okay, number sounds right. Like if you go through a Toyota plant in Kentucky or San Antonio, Texas, or in Japan, like I've had the privilege to do, you almost constantly hear the music and the chimes that play, and the light somewhere is blinking. It is very routine. And for all of Toyota's continuous improvement and waste reduction, they are not perfect. So the andon cord gets pulled a lot. The Ford truck plant, again, this is the BBC's reporting and being on hand and talking to people. The cord got pulled 2 times per week. because, and I always figured somebody on first shift had to test it once a week, and someone on second shift also had to test it. But the real test is and I worked at General Motors, where it was a really crappy environment in 1995 under a very traditional plant manager before I got to work for a Toyota trained plant manager. But I know that environment was quantity first, that you would get yelled at for slowing production. Don't you know how expensive it is to shut the line? Yeah, in the short term, but how expensive is it to keep cranking out junk and fixing it later, and some of it slips through to the customer? So I would never look at that comparison and say, oh, Toyota employees are clearly 1,000 times better at seeing problems. No. Oh, Toyota people are clearly 1,000 times more brave about speaking up. No. It's all about the environment. And I guarantee if you took a Toyota person and threw them into that Ford plant, and they'd learn really quickly, don't pull the andon cord anymore. That's the same person in a different fishbowl. And I've been really trying to follow up with Ford people, including Ford Communications, of help me write a story about how things have gotten better at Ford. And I haven't heard anything. And I'm trying to help tell a happy story instead of just crapping all over you for this 20-year-old story. Even, Ford Communications, they reached out and got a little pissy about something I blogged about recently. And I'm like, hey, all right, that opened a door. Hey, okay, I'll tweak that headline to be a little bit more fair, I guess. But while I've got you, and I've followed up a couple of times, I'm like, all right, they don't want to talk about it. Maybe things haven't gotten better. That's my assumption.
That is an assumption. Yeah. Well, I think you're onto something with the environment and environmental design and culture. And you spend a lot of time in healthcare. And I know not exclusively, you work with many different types of companies now. But in healthcare, do you see those same habits of I can't speak up because I will get yelled at? Do you see that?
Yeah. Oh, yes. Well? And it's sometimes as bad or worse than some of these bad manufacturing environments. And that was wildly disappointing to me. I came in to first start working with healthcare organizations in 2005. The organizational, the typical managerial hierarchy is very strong. The professional hierarchies and pecking orders are very, very strong. So if you speak up, you might get punished by your manager. And if you're a nurse, you might also get punished by a doctor, and the level of psychological safety is usually, I will assume, unless proven otherwise, there are exceptions. I will assume the level of psychological safety in a hospital is really low. And the thing that to me is really sad, I think everybody deserves a good work environment. But when I think about the parallels between, again, connecting dots, because I've seen these environments, a UAW assembly worker who didn't finish 8th grade being treated exactly the same way as a hospital laboratory professional with 2 master's degrees. They're just as abused and put upon and not supported and blamed individually for systemic problems. That should be the other meme that gets around, is that Toyota doesn't blame and punish individuals for systemic problems. Healthcare does that constantly. And it's to the detriment of patients. It's to the detriment of nurses and healthcare professionals who get burned out and quit. It's not due to, it might be in some cases due to overwork, but it's really more of I don't get treated respectfully. That's a huge problem in healthcare, I hate to say. I'm not the only one saying that.
Yeah, it doesn't surprise me. And it's not unique to healthcare either. Software companies, B2B, B2G, B2C services, whatever, hardware, software, it's... So what gives you hope right now? What do you see in your work? Because you've been at this for a while. What gives you hope that there is more attention to, if we don't create a culture or nurture this, it's going to happen whether we pay attention to it or not? Our org environment, are we paying attention to it? Our leadership styles, what's giving you hope right now?
There's a couple of things. One is, a company I've had a role with over 15 years. It's a B2B SaaS company called Kinexus. We're beyond startup phase. It's not a unicorn. It's not setting the world on fire, but beyond surviving, the company's growing. It's a good company. But from the get-go, the co-founders, and I was kind of a third wheel with them. From the get-go, they understood the importance of actually trying to build culture and not just let culture happen. That can't be the only thing that matters, but I think all things being equal, an environment that rewards people for speaking up and for challenging the status quo and for asking questions and for saying, I don't know, and expressing that uncertainty measurably in a pretty objective sense. The measured level of surveyed psychological safety at KaiNexus is pretty high. We're not perfect. Like, the level of psychological safety is high enough we can actually talk about the gaps and the shortfalls and what we could all do better. But a lot of that behavior is modeled. Our co-founder, our CEO, Greg Jacobson, he's an ER doctor by training. Like, he is the first to say things like, I don't know, I might be wrong, I made a mistake, let's figure it out. I mean, it's not a false sense of humility. He's extremely accomplished academically and professionally in two different domains, but like, he and other leaders at the company set that tone. There's not this know-it-allism, there's not this how dare you challenge or question me kind of mindset. So that gives me hope that, we can create those environments when we put our minds to it. It's probably hard. It's probably easier to build it than it is to try to turn around a really crappy, broken culture. It's possible, though. I mean, I've seen it happen in manufacturing and in healthcare. And I think the other thing that gives me hope is there's at least more discussion in kind of the current wave of lean manufacturing adoption and within lean healthcare of at least recognizing and using the phrase psychological safety. Now, the thing you have to check sometimes is like, well, what do you mean by psychological safety? Because there are misunderstandings, just as there are misunderstandings about what does lean manufacturing mean, what does lean startup mean, what does minimum viable product mean? Like, oh, we get to throw shit out in the market and it sinks or swims, that's our MVP? Well, no, right? Sometimes people think psychological safety means like, oh, so we're all coddled and nobody can disagree. But no, not at all. Like a high psychological safety environment has more disagreement, but it's done, professionally and constructively and focused on, the mission and what we're trying to accomplish. That the best idea should win through testing as opposed to the quote unquote best idea, meaning, who had it. So it's optimistic with the caveat. I think people are getting better at it, but sometimes we have to dispel some of these myths or certain kind of incorrect understandings of what these words or phrases mean. But more people are getting it, that none of these lean tools or practices really work without a relatively high degree of psychological safety.
I would agree with that. And I also agree with the levels of conflict. I think that's how I learned it, which was you can disagree and be respectful in tone and use facts, and that's okay. That's actually a good, healthy work environment if you're behaving that way, I know there's always like this inside joke of it's the quiet ones you have to worry about. Yeah, because they're not having actual disagreements, it's all just getting stuffed down and buried and it's just going to explode one day. And so I do think having common definitions or like a shared language within companies is still something we need to work on. And I do say when executives bring me in, sometimes it's one of the things they want to see. They want to see critical thinking skills being used day to day. They also want to hear a shared language versus talking past one another. And so I do think I'm in agreement there with it's not all doom and gloom. We can work on this. We have the tools and we have the language. And we need to see it modeled. We need to see leaders close that say-do gap, like you were saying earlier, like what I say versus what I do. And sometimes they need feedback that maybe they don't get from inside the company. Maybe they need that from an external coach or somebody. So, because sometimes feedback doesn't always make it up to them and they don't even know that they accidentally undermine something with their behavior,
Yeah. Or there's the way the feedback gets asked for. Like I saw recently a relatively clumsy attempt of an executive asking for feedback where he kind of, he talked a lot, first off, and then kind of, it's not the exact words, but he basically said, all right, well, so, somebody tell me what's wrong about this. And the room was kind of quiet. And he was like, this is your opportunity. I'm like, oh, Lord. Like, I mean, like, like on one level, he meant well, but like, it's got to be more like, you can't demand people speak up. And I could just see some of that hesitation in the room. And I had a chance kind of privately to chat with them a little bit about, thinking about the dynamics of why would people hold back? Why would you have to try so hard to pull any sort of constructive criticism out of them? What's happening normally within the C-suite team here and try to reflect. I think the other misunderstanding sometimes around psychological safety is that it can somehow be mandated. Like, oh, we told people it's safe to speak up here now. Like, well, you test that hypothesis. Telling people it's safe now doesn't mean anything. It's the action of if somebody actually goes to test that and say, okay, I'm going to speak up. If they get slapped down for it, doesn't lead to anything. So again, I think a lot of times executives are used to mandating things. I don't think you can mandate culture. You can only demonstrate what the culture is. Lead by example.
I had the pleasure, I may have mentioned this on a previous episode, of working with Alexa Dembeck at DuPont. And she did this thing she called Dead Projects Day. And what we would do is we'd all dress up on Halloween in costume, and we would celebrate the projects we killed. Like, these were not viable in the market projects, and no one was punished. And usually they didn't fail because they couldn't build them. I can build anything. It was more of either the customer didn't really have the need or their needs changed, or they wouldn't pay enough, or even if they pay enough, the switching costs were really high because they'd have to change out something on their manufacturing line, and we didn't uncover that soon enough. So all valid reasons, but it was more of a celebration. Like, we kind of laughed and we were all dressed up. Like, even the execs were dressed up, and it sounded kind of silly at first. But then you start to understand what she's trying to do with that organization, which is it's okay to fail, and we'll actually celebrate it if it saved us hundreds of millions of dollars because we didn't go down a path that wasn't viable. And so I haven't seen that copied, with a lot of other clients yet, but I do think there needs to be equivalent of that inside your org where it's a little silly, it's a little lighthearted, but you are modeling the behavior that, look, you're not going to get passed over on a promotion, or you're not going to be reprimanded for this.
Well, one of the things we do at KaiNexus, and I try to lead by example on this, our software platform is used by companies that are managing continuous improvement projects and initiatives and employee ideas in a very much lean manufacturing or Kaizen continuous improvement model. I've talked a lot about lean without using Japanese words up until there. But okay, Kaizen. And, one of the principles there is, document your idea, document what you're working on, not just document the ideas that were implemented, but I think it's also really helpful to document your quote unquote failures. Documenting a mistake that I made and what I learned from it, documenting something we tried that didn't work out. I think that's healthy. I think a lot of, when people say, people are quick to agree, like, oh, we learn as much from our failures as we do from our successes. I'm like, well, are you documenting your failures so that people beyond yourself can learn from them? Like, I think there's something, really helpful, not just around the culture, but just the practical learning that happens when you document failures. So it can be done in a lighthearted way. You get a failure Friday. The only pushback I've heard, I'm curious if you've heard this, David, is people saying like, "Whoa, there's this failure fetish in Silicon Valley," like taken to an extreme. And I think to me, the phrase "fail early, fail often" is a problem if the often means we keep failing the same way over and over again. Like, we can fail early and learn from it and then succeed. Like, little failures prevent big failures. If it's fail early, fail often means like there's lots of different experiments and we fail often and learn often. I think that's okay.
There are a couple things there. I think, just my time in Silicon Valley, there was the whole move fast and break things, which was pushed a lot by Facebook and Meta. And I think people had a reaction to that, right? Because we've seen the fallout from behaving that way. Also, I don't like this idea of embracing failure. I don't really like framing it that way. It's like, oh, let's give failure a big hug. And it's like, no, we can acknowledge it. We can give it a fist bump and just move along and learn from it. But this idea of embracing it, and no one wants to fail, but we do have to acknowledge it's happened and we do have to learn from it. And so I don't hear it as much anymore. I would say early 2010s, 2015s, maybe it was still there, but I feel like a lot of that's been less popular, less common as far as the failing fast language.
Yeah, I agree with you. I wouldn't say we should be celebrating failure. I think we can be celebrating the struggle. We could be celebrating people for speaking up and acknowledging a small failure, and we could celebrate the learning and the success that would come from it. So, a lot of it's context driven. This idea of celebrating mistakes, like, well, in healthcare, a mistake might be fatal. I'm not going to celebrate mistakes. We should be trying really hard to prevent mistakes in systemic ways. But then when a mistake inevitably occurs, like I like your word acknowledge. Let's acknowledge the mistake and let's focus on learning instead of focusing on blame and punishment.
For sure, yeah. And there's different words to be used there, but I do think we can get together in a half lighthearted, silly way and share how we failed and learn from it, but not be completely embracing it and okay. Like I don't know too many people that are in love with failing. It's just something that's going to happen if you're not playing it safe, and you're not going to grow your business without trying things. So I do think it's just more, you can't go to extremes. You can't just ignore that it happened and then make it look like a success.
Yeah.
I asked you what gives you hope, and I want to kind of wrap up with where you see this is going. Like, is there some fun thing that you're working on that you could share with us that either, you're writing or you're creating something, like what's next for you at the moment?
Yeah. So my little startup ventures, one is in the book category. And I really do think I think every book is a startup or it's a new product. And I think we can test our way to a better book. And hopefully any book that's been published well goes through iteration. That iteration might be an editor working with you about the content, copy editing, proofreading. There's cycles of iteration. Most authors will share a book with trusted friends and colleagues to ask for feedback. It's the same risk of like any startup idea. Like you might not hear a lot of real pointed feedback. There's always that risk as well. But I've been using a process. There's a company that I really like out of Vancouver, British Columbia, called LeanPub. And their idea of lean publishing is basically publish early, publish often. They call it like iterative publishing or in progress publishing, where like their whole model and their website, and people can go buy the book I'm working on right now. I think I'm going to publish it as a title, The Silence Tax, about how, still tweaking the subtitle, but how leaders can help reduce the feelings of fear and futility in an organization. So how do we help people speak up, psychological safety plus some other factors. But people could go on LeanPub and buy, it's this idea like with lean publishing, if you've published it, if you're not slightly embarrassed by what you've published, you treat the book like startup software. And if people like your early adopter fans or whatever say, yeah, I want to read the early draft, even if it's not fully formed, they can pay for that. It's not the landing page of would you buy it, but somebody can actually buy the book. And then when you publish updates, they get the updates and they can send you feedback. And I've gotten some good feedback from people already. And a lot of people are like, I can't be bothered with that. Tell me when the book is done. They can buy it the traditional way. So that's one book the latest book that I'm working on right now. And then the actual software thing that I've been working on, like everyone, I want to do an experiment with vibe coding, that went beyond make me a silly iPad game that only me and my family would find funny for some inside jokey reason. I've done that and that's fun. But then the original idea about a year ago was let me create a search engine for my books. And I was starting off, the first test was with my first book, Lean Hospitals. So kind of playing around and I learned, I could upload my book in the ChatGPT, but I can't embed a ChatGPT window in my book's website. They want you to go to the ChatGPT website. And I wasn't even thinking about monetizing it, but I want people to be on my website. So then I searched and I'm well, God, there's got to be a WordPress plugin that and you're shaking your head. No, I could not find a WordPress plugin. AI told me that there was no plugin for this. So I vibe coded. The first iteration was just a way of embedding and doing API calls to ChatGPT. They'll let you do that, right? So I'm I'm going to vibe code. I'm going to build something. And so I was doing that. And then, I started thinking and testing I started doing the testing myself before I invited others to start testing it. And then I thought, well, better than just searching the book would be trying to maybe there's an AI coach that could be built off of the content of the book that would be a little bit more tightly bounded than just asking a generic LLM of your choosing, questions about lean and questions about what should I be doing and looking for help. And so that became a different product to be building out. And a lot of the testing was honestly me banging on the model and evaluating the quote unquote coaching that came back and kind of changing the high level prompt within the system. And the one thing I learned really quickly, and AI will agree with you if you ask it, AI loves telling you how much it knows. And you think of like, if you're an agile coach or a lean coach or a startup coach, or like, does an effective coach just barf out a lot of knowledge? Well, hopefully no, like not a good coach. And so actually like constraining, I pivoted, I'm using Claude mainly right now as the engine for this. Like it will very, very stubbornly try to get out of coaching mode and back into telling mode. So that's required a lot of testing and a lot of iteration to behave like a Toyota coach might ask, of like asking a question. And like even you can go tell ChatGPT, oh, I want you to coach me by asking questions. And you give it a scenario, it'll barf out 15 questions. Like, no, how about one question at a time and actually have a conversation? So I've been testing and experimenting with that. And then I actually did go to market with this as a product that people can pay, actually sign up for. So that was a fun experiment. And there's different testing and iteration. But the one failure I will readily admit to here, even for all of my Toyota mentoring, for all of my reading of Eric's books and Steve Blank's books and books by others, guess what? I fell into the trap of having fun building features. And my quote unquote minimum viable product was way beyond a minimum. It was way over featured. It was way over complicated. So I've had to go, and I should probably still do more pruning and pulling, more out. So, I got caught up in the excitement of, can I build this, instead of back to your question of, should I be adding these features? Should I be building this coach model to begin with? So, but, it was low cost, low stakes. I'm like, well, this could end up being a side hustle. It could end up being a business. I still don't know if there's really a business model. But at the very least, like I've enjoyed myself. I'm a kid of the 80s where I used to write programs in BASIC and save them to a cassette tape. Like I'm that old. Even vibe coding. I know I'm being more like a product manager than I am a coder, but that co-creation cycle was fun and I've learned a lot. And, if that's all I get out of it, then so be it.
No, I love that you're playing with that stuff and you're open. And I get the same feedback. I'll explain something that's super overcomplicated and people are like, yeah, there's a book out there that'll help you test that. And I was like, yeah, I wrote that book, but it's not always easy. It's easy. It just humbles you in a way that in writing a book's a very humbling process too, of just, oh my gosh, this is why it's so hard for people to follow our advice. There's all this lore of creating, because we like creating things. But no, I think publishing, book publishing, it's interesting. So we tested our book too. And I feel as if now, though, it's almost like publishing hasn't quite caught up yet. And I do think this idea of an AI companion, or can I have a conversation with the author about this book and not just reading, the returning parts of the book, I do think there's something really interesting there. And vibe coding the quality has increased and the tools are just evolving every day. But I do think there's something there with publishing, changing the model and LeanPub's awesome too, the way they handle it, being more iterative, being more digital friendly. Trying to get just a Kindle version of my book still is a pain. And it doesn't even work on the old Kindles. So it's like, I do think it'll be nice to see the change happen in the publishing industry too, where as authors, we get to be a little bit more creative about how people interact with our content.
Yeah. Well, in the way I'm doing that, mainly my last 2 books and now this book, I don't like to call it self-publishing because I certainly don't do it alone. I call it indie publishing. You can be more innovative. You can be faster. You can have fewer constraints or fewer bad assumptions that you're locked into from decades past. So that I'm a big advocate for independent publishing and partnering up with people that are working with you to bring something to market that's as good, if not better, than a traditional publisher might. And I see people doing innovative things around AI companions with their books, and there'll be a lot of interesting experiments, some of which will work and some of which won't. But
yeah, it goes back to testing.
Yeah.
So we'll put those links in the podcast so people can definitely find you and find the book. If people want to reach out directly to you, though, what's the best way, if they've listened to this and say, oh, wow, we need Mark's help, what's the best way for them to reach out?
So email mark@markgraban.com. Web address, obviously, is markgraban.com. I'm most easily found on LinkedIn. If you want to find me on a social media platform, I'm lucky enough that my name is unique enough. I'm easy to find online.
That's amazing. So we'll put those links in the description as well. I just wanted to thank you for hanging out with me. We did everything from because they're like fanboying over Toyota, which it's just amazing to share stories with somebody else who has worked with them and our unique take on how it applies to other companies and working on new books. So that's exciting. I'm really curious to see how that plays out on psychological safety and working on your vibe coding stuff, trying to change how people get access to your knowledge, I think is brilliant. So I just appreciate you sharing everything, the ups and downs and what you're seeing from your day-to-day work. Because you've been at this for a while and I always learn when I hear you talk. So I'm sure our listeners have as well.
Oh, well, thank you. It's very kind of you. And fun conversation. We'll flip the script and have you come on the My Favorite Mistake podcast with me sometime. How's that?
I would love that. That would be awesome. We can continue our Toyota fanboying as well. All right. Thank you so much, Mark, for joining us. And I just appreciate you being available for us today.
Oh, of course. Thanks for the invite.
Thank you for listening to another episode of How I Tested That, where we share stories about experimentation, tips, and tricks. If you learned something new, please recommend us to a friend or colleague. And remember, keep testing your ideas.